Georgia. And usually when I go into town, I go and I do usually the morning news, some radio interviews, newspaper. And I've been invited to be on the morning show, Good Day Atlanta. So to do these morning shows, you have to be there at 6 a.m. I don't know who watches the news at 6 a.m., but someone does. And so I arrive at the studio, and as I walk with my publicist, we're met by the show's producer who informs us I'm not on the show today. There's been a mix-up. I'm on the show tomorrow. Well, my publicist goes berserk because tomorrow's too late. My book signing's in Atlanta tonight, and these women get in a fight. And there's nothing like two women fighting at 6 in the morning. And finally I said, okay, look, she doesn't have any room. There's been a mix-up. I'll make you a deal. If you'll announce my book signing during your morning and noon news, I'll come back tomorrow and do your show. So they agree to the compromise. The next morning I arrive at the studio, and I sit down getting ready to go on the show, and the guy comes over to put the little microphone on when he says to me, "Do you know why you were bumped yesterday?" I said I wasn't bumped. There was a scheduling mix-up. He said, "No, you were bumped. Would you like to know for whom?" I said, "I guess." He said, "We had a woman on the show who was Elvis's pedicurist. And she brought a jar of Elvis's toenails." I said, "You bumped me for a jar of Elvis's toenails?" He said, "Yep, have a good show." That pretty much sums up my life. My daughter McKenna, I have 5 children. My daughter McKenna was given an assignment in school during Martin Luther King week to write an essay that begins, "I have a dream." And she came back and she showed me her essay. She wrote, "I have a dream that someday handicapped people will be able to park wherever they want." Children have a really clear way of seeing life. It was actually 20 years ago this October that I had a dream. It's a dream that many I know that you have. I wanted to write a book. At the time I was writing copy mostly for political candidates and radio commercials, and I always wanted to write something. And I know it's a pretty common desire because that's all I heard the first years. I want to write a book too. And so I decided to write this book. And I thought, well, what do you write? And I heard somewhere that you should write something that's important to you. And I thought, what's important to me? I thought, well, the thing I'm most passionate about in my life right now are my daughters. We had 2 little girls, Jenna, who was 5, and Allie, who was 3. And fatherhood was just an amazing discovery for me. Believe it or not, I didn't want to have children. And I was so madly in love with these little girls, I thought I'm going to write about them. And this is where the miracle began that brought me here and brought me to Kathy. Because as I began to write this little story, the story began to write itself. By that I mean it would wake me up in the middle of the night or early in the morning. Once I pulled off the freeway and wrote an entire chapter on the back of bills and envelopes and whatever paper I could find in the car at the time. This went on this way for about 4 weeks. The peculiar thing is I wasn't sure what the story was about. And then one morning, the story woke me up at 4 in the morning, and I was getting used to this. The story seemed to have its own timeline. I went out to the kitchen table and began to write, when suddenly I realized what the story was about. That the Christmas box was about my mother losing a child. And as I sat there, I had the most distinct impression that I was not alone. At that moment, I felt like that someone was in the room with me. I believe that was my sister Sue, who was stillborn when I was 2 years old. I said out loud, "Sue, you gave me the story for Mom," and immediately it came to my mind, dedicate this book to me, which I did. A few nights later, I went to my wife and I said, "Honey, I finished my book. Would you like to read it?" Which is a very intimidating thing to do to a wife, because either I have to be a good writer, or she has to be a good liar. And so she said, "Well, honey, it's late. We'll do this another time." I said, "You know what? Just read the first 3 pages. It was 11 o'clock at night. Just read a couple pages. If you really don't like it, you don't have to read it." So she started to read it, and she kept reading and reading and reading. Pretty soon, it's almost midnight, and she's still reading. I noticed there's tears streaming down her cheeks. She finished the book and set it aside, and then she fell over and started to cry. Really hard, like sobbing, crying. And I just watched her, and then when she could speak, she said something very telling. She said, "Rick, where did you get that story?" And I told her about the experience I had had writing it, and she said, "It makes me want to be a better mother." 2 nights later, I had the privilege of handing that story to my mother and telling her that I believed that my sister brought it to me. Now, this is the part that's interesting to me, and this is the part that endears me to what you are doing. My mother never talked about Sue. No one talked about Sue. It was something that was not to be mentioned. When my mother lost Sue in the hospital as a stillborn, she was given a flower and told it did not matter. She was told to just go home and have another baby. My mother suffered. She suffered alone. No one understood. My father didn't understand. And she went through that alone. And it had a great impact on her life. And she suffered much. When I handed that book to her, I didn't realize how deep those feelings were. And she broke down sobbing. I also it was Christmas Eve, I gave out copies to my siblings. I went out to Kinko's, I made 20 copies, and handed those out. The day after Christmas, I received a phone call from one of my brothers. I fully expected something like, "Rick, I want you to know you have very poor punctuation." Instead, he said, "I think your little book has changed my life." The next day, I received a similar phone call, and the next day, and the next day. And then a few weeks later, I received a phone call from a woman that said, "Mr. Evans, I want to tell you what your story means to me." And I asked, "Who are you? And where did you get my book?" She said, "I got it from so-and-so." And I said, "I don't know who that is." And I realized for the first time that this little book I wrote for my daughters, that I printed at Kinko's copy centers, was being passed on. So I started to track down those copies. As near as I could tell, since I'd written that book, they had been read more than 160 times. Well, about 4 weeks after that, I received a phone call from a local bookstore who had been going through the Salt Lake City white pages calling all the Richard Evans. And there's 7 of us. So when she got to me, she said, "Hello, Mr. Evans, did you write a Christmas story?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, good, thank goodness. Where do we buy them?" I said, "You can't buy them, the book's never been published." She was dumbstruck. She said, "But I've had 10 orders for that book this week." That's good for any book, but for a Christmas book in February, that's unheard of. Maybe you should publish this book. I thought maybe I should. So I sent it to all the local publishers who quickly rejected this book because it would never sell. So I self-published the book, and that was in 1993. It immediately became a local phenomenon, the #1 book in the state of Utah. But it started to quickly spread outside the state. The next year I decided to still have a publisher. I would publish it nationally. It hit #2 on the New York Times bestseller list, and my world exploded. Publishers are calling with multi-million-dollar offers. I was called back, People Magazine did a story, I was called back to be on the Today Show, and it absolutely exploded. And people start scouring, looking for books. We sold out of everything we had printed. As I said, the book hit #2 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I went back and started meeting with these publishers who were making these enormous offers. And I learned something. That even though the book had hit #2 on the bestseller list, it was only in 5% of the bookstores in America. The book went up to an auction, the highest book auction for a first book in history. And the next year, Simon Schuster won that auction. The book was brought out, and the Christmas box made history by simultaneously hitting #1 on the New York Times hardcover and paperback bestseller list at the same time. Since that time, the book has sold more than 8 million copies. I have troubles with numbers that high. To put that in context, if you were to stack them on top of each other, they'd roughly be the height of 248 Empire State Buildings, or 11 times taller than Mount Everest. The question to me is, why? It's just a Christmas story, right? What I discovered is there's something much more to it. I was at a little book signing, getting ready to I was just signing books, and not many people had come by. My book is brand new. When I noticed across the hall at this mall, a woman was just standing there staring at me. It took her about 10 minutes to get the nerve to walk up to me, and I said, "Would you like the book?" She said, "I've read it." She said, "You're not old enough." "Not old enough to have written the book?" She said, "You're not old enough for the story to be true. I want it to be true. I've lost a baby. I want that angel statue to exist." In the heart of the Christmas box, there's an angel statue where a woman goes to grieve her lost child. I couldn't forget that woman's eyes and how she looked and how sad she was. So I called my distributor at the time, and I told him about the experience, and he said, "We get calls every day about the angel statue." And at that moment I had an impression, you need to bring the angel statue back. The angel statue that's in the book did exist at one time, but it was destroyed in the flood. So I went and I found a local sculptor, and as it turned out, he had lost a child too. And he had no place to mourn his child. And his wife volunteered him. She said, "We will make this angel." And so in 1994, the angel statue was dedicated in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Since that time, it has spread throughout the world. There are more than 100 angel monuments throughout the world right now. I received a phone call yesterday from a billionaire Japanese industrialist asking to help me spread the angels throughout the world. The first going into Japan, then Russia, India, and France. It's a miraculous thing to watch this mission of healing. As people call and say how the book has healed them and brought peace into their lives. To me, the book wasn't about that. The first time someone wrote me and asked and to tell me how much the book had helped them and taken away the pain of their years, I was surprised, because to me it was about not losing the time we have with living children. It had never occurred to me that the book was about those who had lost their children and had lost that opportunity. I had a really remarkable experience. I've had hundreds of them, literally, that everyone who has ever worked for me recognizes the miracle and what's happened. But this is one that really illustrates to me what happens. When I had my office downtown, I used to go up to the angel's statue to meditate. And one day, and I always look at the notes that people leave at the angel statue. And one day, someone had made, it was around Easter, they had made a homemade Easter card. And I opened it up and it said, "To my little girl, I hope there are Easter dresses where you're at. Love, Mom." It really moved me. So I took the card with me. And my dad had made me a Christmas box, and I would put the card inside there. I would keep special things inside that Christmas box. About 6 months later, I was on book tour. I was speaking about grief to a large crowd, and afterwards a woman came up. She said, "Mr. Evans, what you said was very healing for my daughter and I." She said, "My daughter has lost a child, a 4-year-old girl. She would like to speak with you, but she's a bit emotional." She's standing over there, and I looked over, and a very young woman, looked like she was barely 20, and she was sobbing. And I said, "Well, let me go talk to her." And I walked over to her. And as I walked up to her, I had a vision. And I saw very clearly that Easter card. And she said, she looked up and she wiped her eyes. She said, "Mr. Evans, I've been to your angel statue in Salt Lake City." And I said, "I know. You made an Easter card. And you wrote, 'I hope there are Easter dresses where you're at.'" Her mother stared at me, concerned about what I was saying. She knew nothing about him. The daughter just stared, and the tears stopped, and she said, "How did you know that?" I said, "I just saw it." She looked at her mother, and she said, "Yes, I did." And for that moment, the three of us shared this remarkable miracle. Another experience, it was when the Christmas Box was the #1 book in the world. It was I had one last signing my publisher had thrown together. It was a Saturday before Christmas at a Walmart. It was a dangerous place. The line stretched about a quarter mile at least. And I'm sitting there signing books as fast as I can. I'm exhausted, and suddenly this woman walks up outside the line, and she just stands there and stares at me. And after a few minutes, she shouted at me. She yelled, "I don't have time to wait in your line, Mr. Evans." And the people in line turned around to look at her. They were annoyed because they'd been waiting for hours in some cases. She said, "I just wanted to tell you that my little girl was hit by a car last Wednesday and killed. I've read your book every day since then. It's the only thing that's keeping me alive." I stood up and I walked around and put my arms around her. And she just fell into me and just wept. When I came back and started signing books again, people didn't care so much if she got in line in front of me. It was during this time that Chuck and Kathy Lambert came into my life. And it seemed that we had a similar path. And they have been close family friends for a long time. They traveled to Italy with Carrie and I. They were close friends with my parents before they passed away. And my parents loved you dearly. And you know that, Chuck and Kathy. You meant a lot to them. Your friendship meant a lot. So I love what is happening here. I would like to share with you just one thing before I sit down. You know, you drove here in a horrible storm, some of you. We don't get hell like that in Salt Lake. That was pretty cool. Unless you were in it, I'm sorry. But many of you have been through much worse storms. You have been through maybe the hardest thing that you can go through, and for that you have my deepest and sincere sympathy. But one thing I have learned, and I know with all my heart, that those who take these experiences and decide to grow from them, to honor the presence and the name and the being of those they have lost, to bring honor to them, and to dedicate their time, like so many of here have, to helping others, become noble to an extent that those of us who have not suffered such will never achieve. We, in most cases, do not succeed in spite of the challenges and difficulties we face in life. We succeed precisely because of them. When we lived in Florence, Italy, we lived actually in the Chianti area where the famous grapes are grown and the famous wines are made. And one day I was out walking, which is what I do for inspiration, and as I was out walking, there was a farmer out in these beautiful vineyards, and I stopped to talk to him. I was practicing my Italian. I said, "Signor, you must have good soil to grow such famous grapes." And he said, No, you cannot grow good grapes in good soil." I thought that was curious, so I looked it up, and sure enough, you can't, because grapes are fundamentally lazy. And if you put them in good soil, they develop very poor root systems. And they take up just barely enough to survive. But because the soil in Chianti is so poor, these grapes, these vineyards grow massive root systems. And the result is a world-famous grape, a very delicious grape that is crushed into make very expensive wines. We are just like that. These experiences are what make us who we are. I learned this lesson in an interesting way. At the age of 40, I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. I'll never forget this experience. I'm sitting in the doctor's office, and after 40 minutes of questions, I said, "Doctor, you're talking like I have Tourette syndrome." He looked up, he said, "You do. You're 40 years old. How could you not have known this?" I just thought I was a little weird. I have 3 manifestations of Tourette's. By the way, I spoke at the National Tourette Society Conference last Saturday in Washington, D.C. it's kind of refreshing to be speaking and not have people swearing, barking, and clapping spontaneously. I have three manifestations. The first is tics. When I was young, I had extremely severe tics. I had more than 23 different tics, including vocal tics. Not coprolalia, not swearing, even though I have the impulse. If I go to like the ballet or someplace quiet, I have a very powerful impulse to stand up and shout horrible things. The second is the need to touch sharp objects. And I always carry sharp things with me. I can actually, what I usually do is I usually take dollar bills and fold them into sharp corners. Anyone who knows me well just calls them corners. My wife can tell how stressful my day was by how many corners I pull out of my pockets. I have 3 electric pencil sharpeners in my den, and I have to touch sharp things. The third is the impulse to spit in the face of famous people. I was in the Oval Office. President Bill Clinton. And the impulse was so strong, I bit my tongue and stepped away from the President of the United States, as my wife quickly stepped in to make sure I didn't do that. So I just thought I was a little off. And then something very profound started to happen. I began to cry. Not a little cry, I was heaving, I was sobbing, and my rational mind is saying, stop it, what are you doing? You're 40 years old and you're crying like a baby in this doctor's office, and I could not stop. And I thought, why are you crying? You have a terrific life, you're a blessed man. And then I realized that I was not crying for myself. I was crying for a little boy who used to sit at lunch alone every day at school. I was crying for that little boy who would hold his face at night because it wouldn't stop moving and it hurt so bad. I was crying for the little boy who was surrounded by all the kids at summer camp because someone called him a freak and they wanted to see what he'd do next. And I wept. And this wise doctor let me weep. And after a few minutes he said, Richard, Tourette syndrome is a gift. I thought, you call this a gift. You do not want to be on this man's Christmas list. This is a gift. He said, Richard, do you know why I'm seeing you today? And I said, you're a doctor. I made an appointment. He said, I'm actually a research specialist, one of the top of the country. I don't take patients. I am here because a colleague of mine told me they were pretty sure you had Tourette syndrome, and I wanted to see what I could do to help you after what you did for me. I said, Doctor, we've never met. What could I have done for you? He said, more than you can imagine. He said, 4 years ago, we lost our only child. He said, no parent should have to bury their child. He said, it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. 4 and since. He said, but what frightened me is I realized I had not just lost my child, I had lost my wife. And I expected her to die soon too. He said she was mourning so heavily that she was gone. And here I am, a psychiatrist, a gifted psychiatrist, and I can do nothing to save my wife. He said that one day I came home and my wife smiled at me. He said, honey, what's happened? He said, frankly, I was afraid because that's a sign when people decide to take their life. All of a sudden they're happy. He said, honey, what's going on? She said, it's going to be okay. He said, honey, what happened? She said, don't be afraid. It's going to be okay. I read a little story today called The Christmas Box. We're going to be okay. He said, Richard, nothing I did helped her. Nothing my colleagues did helped her. somehow your little book healed her. My wife was in a dark, lonely, scary place. And you went in and brought her out. He said, I know what it's like growing up with Tourette syndrome. Not that I've had it, but because I see these kids with Tourette syndrome. I see little boys who want to take their lives. I know about the mocking and the loneliness and the solitude and the bullying that goes on. Because you're different. But do you think that you could have gone in and found my wife if you didn't know what it was like to suffer, to be alone? If you didn't know the path? He said, Richard, you are not Richard Paul Evans in spite of your Tourette syndrome. You're Richard Paul Evans because of your Tourette syndrome. I've thought about that many times over the last 9 years. And you know what? If I had a choice, if I could give away my Tourette syndrome and the happy childhood memories, I wouldn't do it. I choose to have Tourette syndrome. I'm very proud of my Tourette syndrome. I just wrote a young adult book called Michael Vey. The bookstores didn't want it, but it debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's spreading throughout the world. We have 500,000 readers, and it just came out in August. We've had 5 movie offers. I talked to the producer of Hunger Games last Friday, and we're turning them all down. It's about a boy with Tourette syndrome. And what I love is all across America, these kids with Tourette syndrome come to my signings. I'm sitting at the signing, and that's a great thing about Tourette syndrome. You can pick them out. And there's a little girl who's blinking really hard, and she's just adorable. And she's probably 9 years old, and when it was time to sign, she walked up, and I said, hi, sweetheart, what's your name? She said, Amy. I said, Amy, may I tell you a secret? I leaned forward and said, Amy, I have Tourette syndrome. She said, so do I. I said, isn't that great? She said, it is? I said, it is. You're a very special girl. And someday you'll understand why. And I looked up, and the mother was standing there with tears streaming down her cheeks. And I understand, because my son Michael, who I wrote the book for, has Tourette syndrome. More severe than mine. But I know that if he chooses correctly, that his affliction will become his greatest ally. And I know that is true of you. And may that give you hope. I can't imagine. I have imagined, but I can't truly imagine what it would be like to lose one of my sweethearts. I am sorry for your loss. I brought copies of my book for all of you to give out. The Walk. It's about a man who's lost his wife, his home, his business, everything. He decides to walk across America. But it's really about searching for hope. And I suppose that's why we're here today. May you find that hope. May you find God. May you find meaning and purpose. May you find your best self. Thank you for letting me be here with you today, and God bless.